To introduce our speakers tonight, our MC, Patricia Karvelas, is a prominent and highly respected Australian journalist, beginning her professional career at the ABC and SBS 20 years ago. She currently presents RN's flagship radio current affairs program, RN Drive. I heard her on my way in tonight, a role she took up in January 2015. In 2018, Patricia, she also hosts a national affairs television program on ABC News 24 channel, Sunday evenings at 9 p.m, featuring in-depth interviews with a range of influential Australians. Patricia co-hosts the ABC's popular weekly political podcast, The Party Room. She's previously hosted and produced the program Karvelas on Sky News, a program which focused on federal politics and policy. And she's worked for the Australian newspaper and was the paper's political correspondent in the Canberra Press Gallery. She's also employed as the Australian's Victorian Bureau Chief and Editor and Senior National Affairs Journalist. Patricia will come onto the stage immediately following Mr Rudd's keynote speech. The Honourable Kevin Rudd needs very little introduction, but I'll say a few words. As we know, he served as Australia's 26th Prime Minister from 2007 to 2010 and again in 2013, and as Foreign Minister from 2010 to 2012. He led Australia's response during the global financial crisis, and Australia was the only major developed economy not to go into recession, and he co-founded the G20. Mr Rudd joined the Asia Society Policy Institute in New York as its inaugural president in January 2015. He's chair of the board of the International Peace Institute and chair of Sanitation and Water for All. He's a senior fellow at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government, a distinguished fellow at Chatham House in London, a distinguished statesman with the Centre for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., and a distinguished fellow at the Paulson Institute in Chicago. Mr Rudd is also a member of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organisation's group of eminent persons. He serves on the International Advisory Board of a Schwarzman Scholars Program at Tsinghua University and is an honorary professor at Peking University, so he's still pretty actively engaged in public life, you might say. Mr Rudd is proficient in Mandarin Chinese, and he remains actively engaged in Indigenous reconciliation, a process he so notably enhanced by his moving apology to the stolen generation 10 years ago. Please join me in welcoming Mr Rudd to the stage. Thank you.
Well, good day. It's great to be back in Melbourne and the People's Republic of Victoria, and all you fine progressive folks. And thank you for that warm welcome from LaTrobe University, and thank you, Chancellor, for your kind and genuine remarks. Therese, my wife, is with us as well, and Therese was living in this fair city of Melbourne for quite a number of years during your high school years. When we were dating, I used to come down here a lot and discovered buildings where you had escalators and lifts and all sorts of modern devices for those of us who came from provincial Queensland. So it's good to be back in Melbourne, a city that I love dearly. Tonight, in our available time, given the subject I've been handed, I'd like to make some observations about the state of our Australian democracy. And I'd like to talk about essentially three things. One, a little bit about how we came to be a democracy in the first place. And second, what currently ails the democratic project around the world and here. And thirdly, what we might do about it. And I'll have some particular remarks to make about the nature of the media in our current democracy and the role of the Murdoch media in particular. The reason why it's important to address this subject is because democracy is a relatively recent historical project. For those of us who are students of history, 4,000 years of recorded history, we can see ourselves as having been collective Western democracies for about 100 years. If the definition of democracy is universal suffrage, reflected through representative institutions of parliaments and congresses and assemblies, responsible to the people and arbitrated over by a system of independent courts, an independent legal system. This is relatively recent in the overall scheme of things. And therefore, when we look around the world today, it's still a relatively fragile proposition. Freedom House tells us that of 195 nation-states across the United Nations, 88 are regarded as free and functioning democratic systems. Not even half. So given, frankly, the short historical lens that this has been our collective political experience, and the fact that this democratic project is far from universal across the world, it's important that we reflect carefully on its future. When we look at how we came to be democracies, this really has been a process of evolution over probably some 400 or 500 years. Yes, we look back to Periclean models, we look at the Athenian assembly, but essentially this was an oligopoly of blokes, and a certain category of blokes as well. Blokes is an ancient Greek term, in case you hadn't worked it out. Blocus maximus. Sorry, that was Latin, not Greek. But whatever our sense of romance might be about the origins of the concept of the democratic state, frankly, in its modern evolution, we look at the combined impact of the Reformation, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the rights of man, as then called, or the rights of humankind, as subsequently called, and through the course of the late 18th and through the 19th century, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the great revolutions of 1830 and 1848, before we finally see the unfolding of what we might begin to approach as calling a popular franchise in the latter part of the 19th century, and frankly a universal franchise involving women, well into the 20th century. So these philosophical evolutions from a effectively theocratic state prior to the Reformation and the Renaissance, through to absolute monarchies in the period of the modern nation state, particularly after Westphalia in 1648, through to the present time, the evolution of the concept of the intrinsic dignity of human beings, that human beings could be regarded as having equal political rights, and that as a consequence representative institutions should represent their collective voice, was a long and painstaking process. Which brings me to my first point for our discussion this evening. It's therefore not necessarily a permanent project. It's a project which therefore has to be carefully husbanded for the future. When I have looked in the past at Francis Fukuyama's proclamation, The End of History, the ultimate destination of history being the final triumph of what he would describe as democratic capitalism, said in the hubris which postdated the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War in 1991, frankly, it just ain't like that. And therefore, for those of us who care for this historical project called democracy and for its future, we need to be mindful of how long it was in the formation, how difficult it was for those who became the pathbreakers and the founders and the pioneers of democratic emancipation, and be mindful, therefore, of how carefully this garden we call democracy and the associated freedoms with it must now be tended. There is nothing necessarily inevitable or permanent about the democratic project. In the collective West, in those other countries which have taken up democratic forms of government, and even in this country that we proudly call our own here in Australia. For Australians, it's kind of remarkable that our evolution and emergence as a modern nation state came at this point where the franchise was evolving in most of the countries of the collective West. When we federated finally in 1901, already we'd had semi-representative assemblies in most of the states, or colonies as they then were. And the fact that we federated at a time when the franchise was already had begun to be universalised in many but all Western countries has meant that in our federated history we've assumed it has always been thus. But frankly, just before we federated, and certainly more than half a century before, other authoritarian forms of government were almost universally the norm. So for those of us who are Australians who pride ourselves in our relative national youth and the vigour of our democracy and assuming it has always been our permanent condition, we need to be mindful of, frankly, the more tenuous and recent and hard-fought philosophical foundations on which our democratic forms of government have been built. So my first point to all of our friends here this evening is simply this. When asked the question, how do we rekindle and rejuvenate our democracy for the future, I would encourage each and every one of you to spend a little time reflecting on its history and where it has come from, and the painstaking and painful process of extracting us as human beings from the clutches of one form of political or religious tyranny or another. What therefore constitutes the challenges to democracy writ large, beyond the particular challenges we've confronted more recently in Australia? If we look across the world at large, and the European democracies, in the United States, where I now live and work, I see several challenges common to many modern and so-called mature democracies. These, for many of us, are self-evident, but it's worth at least examining them, at least for a moment. The great disruptions of the 21st century democracies are first and foremost, I think, being driven by the catapulting change, the tumultuous change and disruptions from the new technologies. You know this, you see it in the workplace. But when we look into the lens of the future and see, therefore, what the great disruption of artificial intelligence is going to do to the security and stability of work, as we have known it for a long time, we see emerging what I see to be a deep disruption of the fabric of our democratic life. For this reason, if people can no longer be productively employed with decent remuneration and with decent safety nets in a world governed by artificial intelligence, we don't have to be Rhodes Scholars, friends, to conclude that the underpinning democratic fabric begins to be challenged if it cannot, through its democratic discourse, produce a response to deal with this deep disruption to people's individual lives, their work, their sense of dignity, and therefore their stake in the common project that we call the Australian or the Western democracy. Which brings me to the second systemic challenge, which is the fracturing of the social contract. In the United States, I see this acutely, where you have this concentration of wealth at one end, a stagnating middle America at the other, and frankly, the working poor, given that there is now technically full employment in the United States, barely struggling to survive. The social contract, a French term, but one which has been imbibed into the Australian tradition of a fair go in late 19th century and early 20th century Australia, is part and parcel of how we've sustained the vitality of our democracy over the decades with the evolution of one government into the next. And it's a social contract which basically has the characteristics that there should be something maximally approaching an equality of opportunity, something which provides a humane safety net, and something which therefore causes our society to cohere around a common set of secular values. But there is something fracturing in that social contract, and the impact of the new technologies is likely to fracture it further. So unless we can, through our modern social contract in this country and other Western democracies, continue to effectively and fairly redistribute the wealth of our country, then frankly the democratic fabric starts to fracture even further. I see that most acutely in Trump's America, and I worry about its future in the United Kingdom, in Germany, in France, and the other great democracies of the collective West. We have also, across the collective West and other democracies, now what might be called the absolute balkanisation of news, the third great disruption. Part and parcel of the emergence of modern democracies and the universal franchise and an informed citizenry exercising the vote in electing assemblies has been a common basis or understanding of the events of our society, the events of our economy, the events of our politics. And it has been really for the last 100 years or so of mass communication through mass newspapers and then mass radio and then mass television, there has by and large been a relatively common platform for discourse. Of course, the newspaper traditions and the media traditions have had different political biases. That's normal and natural in a political system. But when you came down to questions of essential fact as opposed to alternative facts, there was a common basis for the discourse. We might then have a range of opinions based on our philosophical predispositions as to how we should then take the country forward, but there was little contest on the underlying facts which formed the basis of our discussion. The social media revolution has changed all that and turned it onto its head. At one stage, and at one hand, massively democratising and massively liberating in terms of the conveying of news, and I have the largest Twitter following in the country as a political leader, so I'm not complaining about it. But let me tell you, it's deeply disruptive as well, because the common discourse for our democracy, through which we make then decisions based on commonly perceived facts about our common future, begins to shake. What I see in America most acutely is a combination of that social media phenomenon combined with the absolute polarisation of the classical news mediums into Fox's America and the New York Times America, whereby these warring tribes no longer even bother or try to consume each other's news or distillation of the facts. That therefore you have within our countries and in our democracies an inability to have a discourse about the facts before you overlay whatever political opinion we may bring to bear on those facts. This is a new and deep disruption, barely a decade old, and one with profound consequences for the future of our democracy. If there's a fourth great disruption, it's probably along these lines, and that is we also are at a time in the evolution of this idea that we call the West, at a unique time in history when our concept of underlying values, secular or religious, are beginning to fracture fundamentally. In the history of the collective West, the Judeo-Christian ethic, which has underpinned much of the values proposition, including the Enlightenment overlay, has been with us for some centuries. But we are now at a juncture in the first couple of decades of the 21st century when, in the collective West, the Christian church is in radical decline. And as a consequence, the values overlay of that tradition is itself also under deep challenge and fracture. Now, whatever the people in this audience may think about the value of Judeo-Christian ethics, and there's a debate to be had about that, one of its core propositions was the intrinsic dignity of the human being, which in many respects translated it through to the Enlightenment idea of, therefore, the political dignity of each human being and the equality of each human being in terms of political discourse and the rights which therefore proceed from that. But together with other values inherited from that tradition, such as compassion, such as solidarity, we now see a great fracturing of, as it were, the theological and partly philosophical traditions which underpinned that particular tradition within the West. And it is happening at a time when we've got this assault from the outside delivered by the new technologies disrupting work, this assault on the social contract and the extremes of wealth which are threatening the future fabric of that contract, and the balkanisation of news, and the decline of traditional institutions, not least the Roman Catholic Church through recent scandals of monumental proportions, of some of the underpinning values assumptions which subconsciously or consciously have informed our view of what makes our society function and our political expression of what that society stands for. And the final big disruption which is occurring at this stage is the rising confidence of the new authoritarianisms around the world, whether it's of the Russian variation, the Chinese variation, or other variations. And whereas Fukuyama said these guys are destined for the historical high jump when he wrote The End of History, the reality is they haven't been for the high jump. The Russian authoritarian system has reconstituted itself, albeit turbocharged by the new technologies of social control and the powers and capacity of the intelligence and security apparatus. And our Chinese friends are taking it even further. And so we have now a Chinese authoritarian capitalist model not only being developed, in some respects perfected within the Chinese system itself, but now quietly and subtly on offer to many other developing countries around the world. And for those who have assumed, particularly in the United States, that there's this universal beacon light, this clarion call out to the developing world, that there is this light on the hill called the democratic destination. If you had 400 or 500 years of colonial exploitation by one of those democracies, well, it doesn't have the same shiny appeal as those of us in the collective West assume. And therefore, when someone else rolls in with an authoritarian capitalist model, it may in fact have more appeal than many people in this room may think. I remind you, only 88 of the 195 nation-states of the United Nations are classified by Freedom House as full functioning and free and open democratic systems. So friends, these I see as the huge systemic challenges facing all of our democracies. The new technology, the fracturing of the social contract, the balkanization of news, the epochal change in the underpinnings, philosophical and theological, of values which have been assumed for the functioning of our democracies for so long, and the rise of the new authoritarianism. And frankly, all happening at the same time. And we wonder why we're feeling a bit perplexed. Well, all that's at work. Which brings me to my third and last point to address this evening, which is, and what's happening here in Terra Australis Incognita. That's our home, our country called Oz. Well, there you go. There's a challenge. The reason I've gone through these other factors, though, is that we, like the rest of the democratic systems around the world, are facing these systemic challenges. We're not immune to the ones I've just described, but we also have particular ones, particularly which go to the whole question of the stability of our politics and the stability of our political leadership and the factors impacting on that. What I see as an additional set of factors bearing down on the Australian democratic experience are these. Within our two major democratic political traditions of the centre-left, which I represent, and the centre-right, which others represent, is the rise of what I describe as the new apparatchik generation, what I describe as legions of young Labor and young Liberal political activists, who in their training over the last 20 years or so have been taught that the way to get ahead in politics is essentially to knock off the bloke ahead of you, or the woman ahead of you, or whoever is ahead of you. I was horrified when I first heard in the Labor Party an axiom which said, well, mate, you've got to catch and kill your own. I thought, that sounds brutal to me. But in fact, it's an imbibed principle in how many of our young political generation have been taught, educated, developed, cultivated, inculcated. Not to think in philosophical terms, not to think in policy terms, but to think in pure Machiavellian terms. I don't have a halcyon view that it was once a perfect Athenian, Periclean experience back in Menzies' day, or back in Chifley's day. It wasn't. But the training of this new generation of what I describe as the apparatchik class has been a huge factor, as they are now no longer in short pants. They are very much in long pants. And they very much become the boyos, primarily the boyos, of contemporary senior politics across our country. Which brings me to the second point. Historically, we on the centre-left have had a problem with what we call as factional power brokers. Factional power brokers, essentially non-meritocratic, but those seeking to manipulate a political system, in this case the Labor Party, for particular factional ends or sub-factional ends. and the nature of factions being such that it is not essentially a philosophical proposition or a policy proposition which causes people to cohere around a factional group. It's a way of organising power within a particular political party for power's sake alone. But remarkably, the centre-right have now learnt from us, and the factionalisation of the centre-right I find fascinating. If you look at what's unfolded in recent leadership shenanigans on the part of the Liberals, with the rise and fall of Abbott, the rise and fall of Turnbull, the rise and fall perhaps of Morrison, the rise and fall and maybe rise again of Barnaby and the rest. I mean, these guys have taken what I think has been one of the deep cancers of the Australian Labor Party, incorporated it within the Conservative ranks and perfected it in a way in which I didn't think was possible. But the problem is it creates a whole new cynical dynamic within the politics of these parties, whereby the public stand back and look with horror at what is unfolding, as if these parties and those who run them are completely deaf to what the country at large aspires for our political process, which is a sober deliberation on the country's, the communities, and the Earth's future. Power brokers, the second problem. Then there is what I call the Australian particular disease, which I call the cult of the opinion poll. I call it a cult. In fact, it's becoming occultish as well in the way in which it's handled and used and abused across our political class. I remember very well as leader of the opposition and as Prime Minister and the state of collective angst which would descend every second Sunday evening before the Monday fortnightly news poll would come out. Would it be triumph or tragedy, success or defeat, the beginning of history or the end of history? Is my job on the line, or can I stave it off for another fortnight? Now, everyone in the political class will tell you that we don't pay attention to opinion polls, and a squadron of pigs just flew by. Okay. The bottom line is, its ability to turbocharge short-termism within our political thinking is phenomenal. And the cult and culture of the opinion poll, produced on a regular basis, effectively reduces the political class to a point of policy paralysis as the energies go into preserving the leader's position, go into defending against any challenge to the leader's position, whether you're in government or whether you're in opposition. So, the apparatchik class, power brokers, perfected by the Tories, remarkably, and the cult of the opinion poll. So that brings us down to the rules of our political parties. Now, the rules of our political parties, both the Liberals and Labor Party, essentially were inherited from our British precedents. The British Conservative Party and the British Labor Party had until the 80s and 90s a system whereby it was uniquely the preserve of the parliamentary party to elect the leader of their choice at any time of their choice. Except that come the 90s, the British Conservatives and the British Labor Party changed their systems to involve a wide ballot of, in fact, not just the parliamentary membership, but the entire membership of their parties as well. But guess what? It's a bit like what happened to Irish Catholicism in this country. That system was snap frozen here and preserved in a way in which the Irish Church today would no longer recognise. Similarly with the Australian political practice, within the Liberal Party and the Labor Party, we snap froze these British systems when, frankly, the Brits then moved on and reformed theirs completely. So by the time I became Prime Minister, and certainly the case still with the Conservative parties, we have rules in our political party which enable a midnight coup to be conducted with 30 minutes notice. And you're off. It's on, sunshine. A bunch of factional power brokers trained in the apparatchik class, using the cult of the opinion poll, wander into your office and say, "It's over, Kev. Sorry, it's not personal." But the bottom line is, other democracies have acted to create massive speed bumps against that contingency arising. When I returned to the Prime Ministership in 2013, my one condition to the powers that be within our show was this: I know we're on a hiding to nothing in the 2013 election. My job was to save the furniture. By and large, we did. But the precondition is this: we're going to change the rules of this show, so that in the future for the Australian Labor Party, you can't walk in the door to any future leader and say, watch out, sunshine, your job's gone because you didn't smile at me in the lift the right way and you didn't give my Aunt Sally a job. Because these are usually the elevated policy reasons which give rise to leadership coups. Which is why folk like you become cynical. And so our rule change has meant that if there is to be any challenge to the leader during a political term, if you're in government, it requires firstly a 75% petition from the parliamentary members. That is, 3/4 of all parliamentary members of that party have to sign that petition. Secondly, it triggers then a 3-month process involving a ballot of all members of parliament, which constitute 50% of the final vote, and of all members of the Labor Party nationwide, all 50,000 of them, and they form the other 50% of the vote until a new leader is selected. And in opposition, that is only possible if you have a petition of 60% of the members of parliament before that 3-month process is triggered. What I did was create this ginormous speed bump, which meant that the factional bother boys could not simply walk in, whether it's to Bill Shorten's office or mine or anyone else's, and say, it's over, sunshine, because you're no longer doing what we, the factions, want you to do. If the Liberals had adopted the Rudd rule, and I've urged them now to do so, then we would not have been through the revolving door of 3 Liberal Prime Ministers in 5 years. The obscenity of what we saw unfold recently with Turnbull's demise, within a very short space of time, where we almost ended up with Captain Potato Head as our Prime Minister, my fellow Queenslander Peter Dutton, and he thinks well of me as well, would not have been possible had we had such a rule-based impediment to the factional bother boys being able to have their day. And my call now, in order to rebuild public confidence in our system, where the office of Prime Minister is not a political plaything of the factions, it's an enormously powerful office. I've been there. I know what powers lie at your disposal, lie at your discretion as the Prime Minister of the country, is that we need to have rules-based systems which prevent or deeply impede that sort of behaviour. Which brings me to my final point, which is the question of the surrounding media environment and what I describe as the Uncle Rupert phenomenon. In Australia, Murdoch, uniquely of our Western democracies, has 70% of the print circulation in this country. There is no other Western democracy in the world where that exists. It is a unique set of near monopoly circumstances. Think of me in the People's Republic of Queensland. I wake up of a morning, it's Tuesday, I pick up my suburban newspaper. It's a Quest newspaper. It's owned by Rupert. I go and have my Frosties for breakfast. There's the Courier Mail. It's owned by Rupert. Then I pick up the Australian to see what's happening nationwide. It's owned by Rupert. You have the Age down here. In Sydney they have the Herald, soon to become Channel 9 in both cases, but that's a separate story. And the bottom line is, in my home state, in my hometown, which is the 3rd largest city in the country, a state of Queensland which represents 22% of the seats in the House of Representatives, there is one paper. And what I've seen in my experience in this country and elsewhere in the world is the way in which that news monopoly has been exercised. It's been frightening. Let me put this proposition to you. If it was not for Murdoch's Fox, there would be no Trump today. Fox News has become the vehicle through which we have seen the rolling radicalisation of the American right, from the old Republican Party through to Newt Gingrich's contract with America, through to the Tea Party and through to the Trump Party. It exists within this self-contained ecosystem called Fox, which is 100% owned by our Aussie Rupert. The impact which this has had on the American body politic and the world at large is remarkable. I have people coming to my office regularly now from across the United States to ask me, who is this guy and how did this happen? Were it not for Rupert's ownership of The Sun, and the Times of London and his stake in Sky in the United Kingdom, I doubt there would be a Brexit. The power of the Sun, the power of the Times, one commanding a working class audience, the other a huge influence on elite opinion across the United Kingdom, running a massive Brexit campaign on a sustained basis in an eventual outcome which was 52-48 cannot be underestimated. And here in Australia, one example and one example alone. In the 2013 election, when I returned to the Prime Ministership, the central unstated issue of that campaign was something near and dear to Murdoch's heart. It was the future of the national broadband network. We, the party of nation builders, decided that this country needed, given our vast geography and the arrival of this new technology and the explosion of digital commerce across the world, that we needed to lay out a national broadband network to every city, every town, every part of this vast commonwealth of ours, high speed, great bandwidth, in order to accommodate the new businesses of the future, as they've done now in most other economies around the world. But because of the tyranny of distance and our small population, our vast area, unless the government did it, it was never going to happen. It would happen in dense inner city areas as a product of the market, but not for the regional cities, and not certainly for rural Australia, let alone where I come from, in the Queensland bush. And so therefore we embarked upon that as a nation-building project for the future. It was to be fibre optic cable to the premises, to your home, to your institution, to your school, to your hospital, to your GP, to everybody. Rupert woke up and said, this is a threat to Foxtel, because by virtue of my connecting through the national broadband network to every household in the country, high-speed, reliable broadband, his Foxtel competitors, namely companies like Netflix, would then be able to penetrate every household in the country, and he would face competition. And Foxtel represented $1 billion a year profitable business, cross-subsidising his loss-making print mastheads, the one through which he exercises political control across the country, or significant influence. The unstated proposition in the 2013 election was, I, Rupert, through my mastheads, are going to destroy your government and this proposal. In case you think this is a piece of conspiracy, think carefully about what both Abbott and his then communications spokesman Turnbull then agreed to do. They embraced an NBN model, National Broadband Network model, which was going to abolish fibre optic to the home and leave it as fibre optic to the node. Hence the dog's breakfast that we now have for an NBN across the country. This was not a piece of coincidence. Where did the Liberals, Abbott and Turnbull, launch their policy in Sydney during that election campaign, or just prior to it? At Fox Studios in Sydney. Who presided over it? The Fox News Corporation executives. Could this be a coincidence? I believe in coincidences too, but not that one. Because the alignment of commercial interests was clear-cut. Murdoch had decided to kill a commercial threat to his business, and as a result torpedo a $43 billion investment in this nation's future economy turbocharging infrastructure, a national broadband network which will be delivered to every household and institution in the country. And in case you have forgotten, and if you are interested in getting a hold of this book afterwards, there's a wonderful page in the second bracket of photographs where I simply array the front page stories run by the Murdoch tabloids during the 2013 election campaign. I was either decked out as a Nazi, in some cases as a thief, in one particularly brilliant illustration as Hannibal Lecter, as a cannibal, but the rest of it described visually, graphically, every front page, virtually, my personal crimes against humanity. Because Murdoch had dispatched his senior henchman from New York, Col Allen, then editor of the New York Daily Post, to Sydney, to corporate headquarters, to draft the front pages of his tabloids every day of that campaign. Now, there's a debate to be had about whether it was the single decisive factor in the campaign. I'm prepared to accept there were other factors as well, and of course there were. But you know something? That doesn't remove the fact of what actually transpired in their campaign to delegitimise the government, to delegitimise the Prime Ministership. Col Allen's instruction to the editors and senior writers of News Limited in Sydney that day, when he arrived back from New York, was go hard, go rud, and don't let up until this thing is done. I conclude with this. Trace and I, in New York, last year, maybe the year before, as is our custom in America, we went to a 4th of July party with a friend out in Long Island. And the great and the good from Greater Manhattan are out there. We're in the queue to go and get, your drink, or lining up to go into the marquee for dinner. It was a lovely evening. Sun was out, the band was playing. It's the 4th of July, celebration of American independence. The guy behind us in the queue heard our very cute Australian accent and said, "You're from Australia?" And to which my wife said, "Yes, we are." I usually say at that point, "I'm from New Zealand." Because you never know where the conversation's going to go. Any Kiwis here tonight? I'm sorry. One of the old Foreign Service tricks, you get into trouble, you say, "I've got to get back to Wellington." Sorry, tradecraft. So Trey said, "Yes, we are." He said, "You must know my best buddy, Carl Allen. He's the editor of the New York Post. He's an Aussie." And Trey said, yes, we know. He's an Australian. He said, "He's a great guy." He said, "He's done some great things for Rupert. He went down to Australia. He was there in 2013, and he was sent on a mission by Rupert to take out that socialist president of yours." To which Trey said, "Really?" And the conversation rolled on. And I wasn't going to upset the apple cart, but he's one of those Americans who kept asking the question, "So what do you do and where are you from?" So in the end, I gave up. I said, "I am that socialist president." My friends, our democracy is under challenge. It is under threat. On the question of the future of the Murdoch media and media diversity more generally, that's why I've been calling now for several months for a full royal commission into the abuse of media power by Murdoch, for the prosecution of both political and ideological and commercial interests, with a view to recommendations being made on a new model for media diversity in our country, covering all platforms, not just the print and not just traditional television, but also the social media platforms as well. There's something precious about our democracy. We've got to nurture the garden. But in nurturing the garden, we've got to take out a few weeds as well. And this one is a particularly noxious weed. I thank you for your time.
Okay, my former employer is that noxious weed. Full declaration, I worked for Rupert Murdoch for many years, as you know, Kevin Rudd, because I followed you around in the 2007 campaign when we were both much younger.
That's true, and neither of us have changed a bit.
Not at all. That was fun, although you used to get us up at like 3 a.m. for 5 cities in a day, so you aged me for about 10 years in one campaign.
But it was exciting.
It was definitely an exciting campaign. Do you think you would have been knocked off if you were Prime Minister of New Zealand, by the way?
You know something, I don't even know their system for the election of the leader of their respective parties.
Of course you do.
No, I don't. I actually don't. And so therefore I can't actually easily answer your question. It's a different political system down there. More generally, it's a different political culture. But there's one key fact, is that there is no big Murdoch footprint in New Zealand, and there's no big Murdoch footprint in Canada. If you go to the Anglosphere, made up of 5 countries, the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, 3 of them are dominated in one form or another by the Murdoch media, 2 are not. And Canadian politics, what we've just been discussing about the impact of one publisher on the democracy, is not a factor.
I didn't want to start with the Murdoch media, but you've gone there, so let's let me change my order of events. I was actually just going to start with some of your policy successes, but we will go to the Murdoch media.
Well, let's do successes.
I thought you might like that. But no, let's go to the Murdoch media. I'm a very cheerful person. On the Murdoch media, you cultivated Murdoch editors, didn't you?
To the greatest extent that I could, because I'm a Labor leader of the opposition wanting to form government, and they have 70% of the media, and you do whatever you can.
So why is it that Prime Ministers at the end, Malcolm Turnbull recently did it, you've done it now, always criticise the media at the end, but not at the beginning?
If you look at the period of that campaign in 2007, the mythology from your former employer, the Murdoch mob, was that they endorsed me and supported me.
They did endorse you.
Hang on, and supported me in my efforts to become Prime Minister. The reality was, as you'll remember from the days of the Oz, is that Murdoch, and I think some of the editors in Sydney, concluded that a change of government after 11 or 12 years of Howard was kind of inevitable, and therefore his style or method that I've seen elsewhere in the world is that when someone from the centre-left is lining up and it looks as if a change in that direction is inevitable, then editorially, through a major masthead, they will basically be positive. At the same time, throughout 2007, Patricia, the Murdoch tabloids did everything they could to destroy and defenestrate me personally and my wife Therese. There was a massive attack on her and her business, accusing her of all sorts of violations of industrial relations law, all of which then Howard then took gleefully, having fed the story to the Herald Sun in this town, and were then proven to be absolutely false. It put us through 3 months of living hell and was an attempt to derail my campaign. So therefore, the idea that the Murdoch mob were behind us 100% going into 2007 is just empirically false.
Okay, but you mentioned Murdoch in terms of Brexit in your speech. You also mentioned Murdoch in terms of the rise of Trump. But don't voters, they make up their own minds. They're smart people. Every voter thinks. The idea that they're told what to think. Well, are you going to contest that? It's a pretty contentious thing to argue.
Well,
you're not in office now, so you probably can, but it is a contentious thing to argue.
Well, the reason why political parties, particularly the Conservatives, run campaigns based on naked emotion and fear is because they know with a certain proportion of the electorate it works. Why does Murdoch focus, and his press focus on fear about debt, deficit and asylum seekers? Because he wants to make you fearful, afraid and frightened. And the advertising campaign meshes, frankly, the Murdoch newspaper agenda. We saw it in 2010, we saw it in 2013, we saw it in 2016. So for a certain, the honest answer to your question, for a certain slice of the electorate who are not engaged with the debate, who don't come to a gathering like this to talk through the major public policy debates at the time, it is a more primal, emotional experience. And that's where the power of a front page, Kevin Hannibal Lecter, or a million asylum seekers about to race down the hill waving Allahu Akbar at you, has an emotional effect. That's why they do it.
You talk about disruption, though. Would you also concede that the so-called Murdoch press or the dominant media is losing its influence?
It's a really interesting point, Patricia, and it's more complex than it used to be. And partly through let's call it the democratisation, some would say the balkanisation of news media platforms. But what I notice still about the power of print media is that Rupert's not dumb. He holds on to these things because they've still got influence. How do they have influence? If you run around this country and do a bunch of radio interviews, and I've been doing a stack in recent days, Sydney here, Canberra, back to Brisbane Vegas on Friday, my hometown. Then what you see sitting in all those FM radio stations is that day's newspapers. And the rip and read effect of, God, we don't have any journalists ourselves, we're just broadcasters, we're just running a radio station, is they pick up the newspaper, the Courier Mail, the Daily Telegraph, and they kind of read that into the day's radio news. It dominates, therefore, or significantly influences the discourse. On voting day, does it have a decisive effect? Open question now, in 2018. But let me tell you, it does or can prevent you as a government or a political party from advancing alternative policy agendas because it's dominated by the news stories which are rip and read into the electronic media.
Okay, you've heard the defence of Murdoch editors who've said we don't get orders quite like you think.
Yes.
Well, reporters do their job. I mean, I know I've been one. They're not told what to write. They say that. Are you saying they're lying?
Well, I know enough News Limited journos around the country, work both for the Tabs and for the Australian, to know that many of them are left alone. What I also know from some of them is that their stories are rewritten, and particularly the leading paragraphs as it goes into the front page lead. And as a result of that, they don't have to be clairvoyant to work out what Field Marshal Rupert wants. And in case they lacked that level of perception in the 2013 campaign, there you got Rupert personally tweeting during the campaign as to why Abbott was the best thing since sliced bread and why I was the son of the Antichrist, just in case his editors had missed the detail. So they don't have to get the phone call. It is Rupert here from New York, Mr. Editor. Would you please eviscerate Rudd in tomorrow's paper? He'd sent Col Allen to Australia for that purpose. And secondly, in case it was not clear to people, to have the publisher tweeting directly into the day-to-day events of an election campaign, telling everybody again where he stood, has an effect.
All right, let's talk about the book, your legacy, this narrative you've argued, and I've watched all of your interviews.
Oh, you poor thing.
That's how I roll. That's actually, honestly, how I live my life. I watch a lot of other interviews and then I do a lot of them. You say that a story has dominated. I enjoy it thoroughly. Julia Gillard has written her book, of course, Wayne Swan. A story has dominated that you feel doesn't tell the story of what happened to you, the coup. Do you feel like you were losing the history wars?
Not at all. What I said back when I left office at the end of 2013 was that I was heading to the United States. I've been offered a job at Harvard University, senior fellow, Kennedy School, working on China. I was off. I was pursuing a different career. In fact, I'd been offered that job a year before and I was ready to go much earlier. But the bottom line is, what happened in 2014 when I could have written this thing? This mob, that is the Abbott government, as it then was, decided to have a royal commission into the home insulation program with one interest, which was to politically crucify me, loaded terms of reference, and most of the lawyers associated with it regarded it as a completely atrocious exercise from a legal standpoint. In the end, the Royal Commissioner made no adverse findings in relation to myself at all, quite the reverse. But that took all of 2014. These guys just destroy your life for 12 months for politics in order to legitimise the new government and delegitimise the one that had gone out the door. It's a horrible experience, by the way. Then, 2015-16, so why didn't I write it then? Because both Julia Bishop and Malcolm Turnbull had said to me that the government was going to endorse me as a candidate for the UN Secretary Generalship. And so in 15 and 16, I ran a campaign around the world in support of that candidature. Malcolm Turnbull had sat in our house in New York, told me he'd back it. I came to Canberra, I sat in his office after he became Prime Minister. He said that having taken down the list of countries he needed to lobby, told me to proceed. Julie Bishop had organised regular campaign meetings between myself and the diplomatic mission in New York on this campaign. Then Malcolm died 1,000 deaths when both Morrison and Potato Head said that they'd split the party if they did something as radical as back this living socialist as a candidate for UN Secretary Generalship. So that was the end of 2015 and 2016, because that was a full-time job. I started writing Volume 1 last year and Volume 2 this year. So why has it taken this amount of time? That's the reason. Okay,
no, but my question was more about the competing narratives.
I know, but you asked me why have I written it now.
Let's talk about the narratives, though. I want to go back to the narrative.
I've had a fair few other things on my plate.
Okay, so
external variables.
The narrative that this happened very quickly, you contest that very strongly in this book. If anyone hasn't read it here, basically you argue that this actually took a while to cook.
6 months.
that Julia Gillard had determined that she didn't, that she was withdrawing, I think that's the language you use, from the government's agenda essentially. And,
That's true.
And running a... What's the tangible evidence of that? I mean, you point, for instance, to an incident where her and Wayne Swan didn't come to a New Year's Eve function. Is that really... What else can you point
Patricia,
to?
what you're doing there
it?
is pulling sort of one element out of an over.
I am pulling one out. I can't pull them all out. It's a long book.
Yes, but over the course of an entire chapter, there is a whole series of events which, when I look back at it through the lens of history, all form part of a pattern. Also, this is the conclusion of Sarah Ferguson, who, for those of you who watched the television series The Killing Season, 3 parts, she spent a year and a half on this thing and interviewed everybody, including those who hate my guts. And her considered conclusion was that this began back then, the early part of 2010. So the initial argument advanced by Julia at the time of the coup was that, oh dear, the caucus rose up in spontaneous revolt and they demanded that I act, is simply undermined by a series of events in the first half of that year, where Julia was planning actively and working with the power brokers to bring about a change in the leadership. Fair cop, that's politics, but to assert that it was a last-minute spontaneous patriotic act to rescue a country from a guy who'd lost his marbles, that's me, is kind of a bit of a stretch. That's before Julia went on to part 2 of the argument, was that I had lost my marbles and she had to act, which I found a curious proposition. You've known me for quite a while. You may disagree with a lot of what I stand for and what I say in terms of policy, but I don't think anyone's accused me of losing my marbles.
No, I don't generally diagnose people's mental...
No.
And
nor should the
that.
current chair of Beyond Blue, Julia Gillard.
But you reveal in this book, and you've been talking about it, that you offered her a Kirribilli-style agreement. Why should she take that? Why would anyone... I mean, they haven't really worked out in the past for others, have they?
No, but she was... we're moving into the 2010 election, and I knew, self-evident, that Julia was an ambitious woman and a highly capable one. I just wanted to have a heart-to-heart conversation with her about what I wanted based on my experience in Queensland, having observed both Anna Bligh and Peter Beattie as Premier, which was an orderly transition. Beattie had been Premier for 2 or 3 terms. And I already back then had my mind on becoming a candidate for UN Secretary-General in a position which became available in 2016, which would mean leaving office in 2015, if I was subsequently re-elected. So what I was simply saying to Julia was, hey, look, I actually want an orderly transition to you. I cannot name the day, the time and the hour, but let me tell you, once we're into 2 or 3 terms, that's it. Because A, it's hugely punishing. Remember the global financial crisis, no one's getting any sleep. And B, I've got other things to do. Now, I didn't expect her to sort of sign up for the cause at that point, but the whole point of the conversation was to reinforce what I thought I had conveyed to her from the get-go, that I delighted in her success as a female Deputy Prime Minister of the country. I delighted in appointing a woman as Australia's first Governor-General, Quinton Bryce. I delighted in having the highest representation of women in my cabinet. So I wanted all that to unfold. But she was rowing a different race.
Would you have taken that deal if it was offered to you?
But it wasn't a deal. It was a conversation which said, this is where I'm headed. And I was simply trying to explain to her what was in my head. I didn't advance a proposition or an agreement as such. And it's one element of at least 10 events that I point to in the book between the end of Copenhagen, conference at the end of 2009, through to January 2010, when Julia came to see me and said, there's no way I'm going to support you having a double dissolution on climate change or on the CPRS, no way, Jose. Through to that conversation, the February, several others, and by the time you get to May, the drafting of a speech by Julia, which has subsequently been established by others who were working for her at the time, on what she would say on the day she became Prime Minister. So the idea that this was something cooked up on the day itself, it just flies in the face of all the accumulated evidence.
Let's talk about some of the big achievements. The GFC, of course, or avoiding Recession. It was obviously a significant achievement and has been written about by others. You don't really give a lot of credit to your treasurer, though, Wayne Swan, in avoiding the GFC.
Well spotted.
I'm a trained observer. Again, that journalism degree. Is that fair? I understand the Prime Minister had to be hands-on. Obviously, the entire Cabinet had to be hands-on. The Head of Treasury had to be hands-on. I mean, everyone had to be involved in that. But how can the Treasurer not be given more credit? The Treasurer had to be.
Because I tried to honestly reflect on all the critical meetings that occurred. The dynamic was Ken Henry, a brilliant civil servant, and a loyal Treasury officer working for both Conservative and Labor governments, led a team which I dealt with every day. And the ideas in terms of when to intervene and what the opportunities were for intervention, the parameters of possibilities, came from Ken. And I'm just saying that's the fact, that's the reality. I could reconstruct it in a different way, but that would not be telling the truth. And when it came to the big decisions about are we going to do X measure or Y measure in terms of the stimulus strategy, that would turn out to be a discussion between Ken and myself. And Ken would give a series of arguments and I'd push back a bit. And I think if you spoke to the Cabinet note takers and you look at the record when it's finally unleashed after the 97-year rule or whatever it is, 20-year rule, I think.
Yeah.
I think you'll see that's kind of reflected in the reality. I just think the Treasury team are probably the unsung heroes. And I work with them day in, day out. I remember sitting with Ken one night in the lodge and we had a fire going in the study there. It's a nice little room. It's where Curtin used to sit during the war worrying about whether the troops would arrive safely, on one troop ship or another. So I always had a sense of history in sitting in that room. And the whole fire was roaring away and I said to Ken, mate, I think we've kind of tried most things now to deal with this crisis and this unfolding recession, which is what it looked like at the time. What else can we do? He said, Prime Minister, every tool in the policy arsenal has been deployed. And now it's a matter of prayer. So it was a great relationship with the Treasury, and that's why the independence of the Australian Public Service is so critical for the future governance of our country. Politicians come and go. You need really bright folks running the key institutions of the public service.
Yeah, I think that's very true. Okay, on the CPRS.
Yep.
You said that climate change...
I thought you were going to all the positive achievements here. That was deceptive.
Well, the GFC, I said you avoided it. I didn't contest that. Some people tried to, but I didn't.
No, you then opened up on Swanee, but that's okay. Let's go.
Well, I'm a journalist, remember. And as you say, I'm a good observer. I mean, it was hard to miss. The CPRS and climate change, of course.
Carbon pollution reduction scheme.
You said that this was your big, the greatest moral challenge of our time. Is it
I said
still?
that absolutely. And I've said it then, I've said it since, and I'll say it into the future. Because it's fundamentally about an existential challenge to the planet, and it's about intergenerational justice. And frankly, decisions affecting those who come after us most acutely.
So do you wish you had gone to a double dissolution on it?
Well, I'd remind you of what the constitutional provision was at the time, which is that we could have run to a double dissolution as of August that year, 2010. I seem to remember that I got the knock on the door from Julia on the 23rd of June.
But you also talk in the book about how Julia Gillard said she was dead against this idea.
That's true, she was, and so was Swan.
You were the PM, why weren't you more successful in arguing the case
Well, let's just backtrack a little bit on the climate change question, given you've opened it up. What was our first course of action? To legislate a mandatory renewable energy target for this country of 20% of electricity supply coming from renewables by 2020. And when we took over, how much was that? 4%. What is it today? 18%. That legislation stands despite multiple attempts by the Tories to kill it. It is the single engine room, frankly, of climate change action of the country. It's our legislation, it's my legislation against the opposition of what was then your newspaper, by the way. Not that I wish to raise that fact, because we've dealt with Murdoch already, but I just thought I'd mention it was a Murdoch paper. Then, on two occasions, we tried to legislate the carbon pollution reduction scheme. And then you had the Green Party, for opportunistic reasons, jumping in bed with the Liberals, one saying not far enough and the other one saying too far, and killing our legislation twice. It wasn't through want of political effort and negotiating, shall I say, energy. Penny Wong did a fantastic job in almost landing this thing. But the political ambitions of both those parties stood in the road. So we still had an opportunity to take this to a double dissolution. I hadn't ruled that out in my head, but other things were ruled out on the 23rd of June. That's me.
Of course, when you did delay it by 2 years, and that's what, you were...
Well, they wanted to kill it altogether.
Yeah, I know,
Gillard
it was
and
delayed
Swan.
by 2 years.
My compromise position was to
people might not remember.
defer it for 2 years. They wanted to kill it altogether. And Julia's position, which I think she disputes to this day, was she came to me with a piece of paper and said, I said, what's your alternative? And she said, it's called the bipartisan solution. I said, what the hell's that? I said, the bipartisan solution is we will act when Abbott acts. I said, well, hell will freeze over before Abbott acts. So you're handing to the opposition and to the Liberal Party under Abbott's leadership a proposition that we'll never have a carbon price until he acts? I mean, that's just nonsense. So my position was, as the compromise to keep these guys within the tent, that's Swan and Gillard, was a 2-year deferral. And it was bitterly fought over internally. And that's, as you know, what we put publicly.
It certainly was. How much damage did that do to you personally?
A huge amount, because of what then subsequently unfolded. We had this, it was a terrible week. I think it was April of 2010. As you may remember, I'd been uphill down Dale, chairing the health and hospital reform program for the government. And it had been a 6-month exercise in sheer hell, bringing about a whole new funding agreement with the premiers and the chief ministers on who would be responsible for long-term funding of hospital growth and a raft of other health reforms, from primary medical care, preventative health care, as well as post-acute care and aged care. It was a massive exercise. And I had to do it because I had to do the negotiation with the premiers. Roxanne, the health minister, couldn't do that because that's what premiers are like. Anyway, I emerged from that, and you may remember it was a great deal. We got there. April, I was ecstatic. We'd done what I undertook to do prior to the 2007 election, which is to bring about a fundamental reform in the health and hospital system. Then I walk out of that meeting, and there's Swanee and Julia waiting for me saying, okay, sunshine, time to kill the CPRS. I said, what do you mean? And they said, well, we can't afford it in the forward estimates. That is, to budget for it for the subsequent 3 years. And I said, what do you mean? I said, we've got a stalled negotiation with the Tories on this, but, we can still maintain our funding commitment as reflected in the budget's outer years. They said, no, we can't afford that. And so the process of battering me down then began, concluded the next day, and I reluctantly agreed on this compromise position of a 2-year deferral. But it was to go to full cabinet about a week later, by which time Penny Wong would be back, and we would have the debate again as a full cabinet, because I knew Penny was bitterly opposed to it, and I wanted the full input of all the other colleagues. In between time, the decision was leaked to Lenore Taylor in the Fairfax Press on the front page, and I state clearly in the book, by Julia's office, because that, in the great tradition of politics, fences you in. A decision's out, it's a draft decision, it's not endorsed by the full cabinet yet, but then the question comes for the journalist, once it's on the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald, is, did you reach this decision as a cabinet committee, and you, the Prime Minister, do you back that decision as the head of the cabinet? Well, stupidly, I got backed into that and said yes, and the rest is history. Enormously damaging to me was if the full cabinet had backed the decision of the cabinet committee on the 2-year deferral, we still needed at least a week to develop our arguments to put to the Australian people as to why we were going to defer for 2 years. Instead, it was run immediately in the media as me capitulating on climate change. And ever since that day, I've had people like you sit in that chair and say, but Kevin, you said that climate change was the greatest moral challenge on the planet. Why didn't you do X on the CPRS? That's what happened. It was hugely damaging to my standing, and it was ultimately my mistake for taking that decision.
And Lenore Taylor is a friend of mine. She would never reveal her sources, so just to be clear, we don't actually know where that story came from. That is your theory, but we can't prove that. Have to defend journalists. Sorry, but we don't know where the story came from.
I'm just saying nothing, that's all. I'm thinking a lot, but I'm saying nothing.
Often people do assume stories come from places that they don't. I've certainly been, at the other end of that.
And sometimes they come from places that you think they do.
And sometimes we don't know, so let's park it, okay? Let's go to something
It's one of the eternal mysteries of the church.
Let's go to something that I feel very passionately about and I was there for, which is the apology to the stolen generations. I didn't know you were still writing the speech 4 minutes before you delivered it.
Well, it's a busy old time, Patricia.
My kid watches that at school. I didn't know you were cramming.
I was cramming. Well, there's a lot of stuff going on in the government if you're the Prime Minister. So what had happened was, for me, this was core business. I had this fight with some of the colleagues who literally said to me, they'll remain nameless because they'll be shamed too much by it. They said, mate, do you really want to do this as the first item of business? I mean, you'll be seen as one of those Keating types, Mabo, Constitution and the vibe. And
I went against doing it. It was about prioritising.
Me doing it as the first item of parliamentary business for the new government. And I said, come on, this has been hanging around for a couple of 100 years. I mean, let's just get on with it and do it. So, planned that. Jenny Macklin was fantastic. She did so much legwork with the Stolen Generations and the Healing Foundation as we then established it, but also in just preparing for the day. And she deserves a whole lot of credit for that. But I had writer's block. I couldn't write this thing because I didn't know what to say. It's so easy for a politician to stand up and say blah, blah, blah. But I'd grown up with one Aboriginal family in the country town that I grew up in country Queensland. But I didn't know what it was like on the inside of that, and they were not members of the Stolen Generation. Most of them are now dead, kids my age. So that's when I asked to speak to somebody, Nana Fijo, who had been stolen when she was 4 or 5 years old from Tennant Creek. She had come to Canberra to hear the apology. I didn't have the heart to tell her I hadn't written it yet. And so I went out to her place in the burbs of Canberra, sat on the floor for 2 or 3 hours, and just what politicians rarely do, just shut up and listened. And for me, that unblocked the writer's block, because I could hear the voice of a 4-year-old girl being ripped away from her mum. And then I went home and wrote it. Then, just before Apology Day, what else happened? There was a coup, an attempted coup in East Timor, where they tried to assassinate Shana Gusmao and Jose Ramos Horta. It was horrible. And so, as a result of that, we had to... they're going to throw me off the stage in a minute. But after that, we had to do a military deployment straight away to Dili to try and prevent the whole place from imploding. So that took out a couple of days. And so then we're on to the day itself. So I remember, as you say, sitting there, writing this thing, sat up till about 2 or 3 that morning, almost finished it, went to sleep at the desk, and was just feeling like a wreck. And then we'd arranged, Therese was with me and Jenny, and we stood there and welcomed the representatives of the Stolen Generation into the official entrance to Parliament House, which was our idea. And that all took about an hour and a half amidst a sea of tears. And then I had to go back and finish writing this thing because I hadn't got the conclusion done. And by this stage, it's 8:30 for a 9 o'clock start. And then Albo comes in about 10 to 9, says, "Okay, mate, off we go." And he looks down and then he says in a very Albo sort of way, he said, "You haven't finished." And I said, "No, mate, just got..." He said, "God, you leave it close." But I was still knocking it round at about 5 to 10 walked in, 5 to 9 walked in, and that's kind of how it was done.
Just before I take audience questions, and they should have budgeted 4 hours for us, Ken.
Yeah,
at least.
That's right.
But
Because you talk so much, yeah.
When one gives me a chance. Last page of your book. last page of your book, you say you want to reconcile.
Yeah.
Doesn't this risk reopening some Labor wounds? I mean, for instance, you reveal in the book that Bill Shorten wasn't too crash hot about some of his appointments. He wants to be Prime Minister now. In fact, he could be Prime Minister within 7 months.
I think the book, Patricia, is a very gentle treatment of our bill. So,
Was that, okay, let's go there. Why so gentle?
well,
Were
it's
you
a gentle
careful
treatment
around
of
the issue of Bill Shorten, given he's trying to be Prime Minister about now?
I thought about it long and hard. No, I thought about long and hard about his actual role in the events of June 2010. It may disappoint Bill that my conclusion was he was not a central player.
Well, he was a factional leader though, wasn't he?
No, that's true. But he was not a central player. And I worked out who it was, and I spoke to a lot of people about this. And had I reached a different conclusion, there would have been a more robust coverage of Bill's activities at the time.
Do you feel more kindly towards him because he also brought you back?
No. That's,
Because he did, he brought you back. He was one of the crucial people
yeah, but
who brought you back.
Bill brought his own vote, and maybe one or two others. But hang on, coming back, like this was terrific. Coming back in 2013, you know, there's this sort of chasm in front of you. It's called the 2013 election. You got the Murdoch cavalry running up to join the coalition to make sure that we were dead and buried completely. At that stage, as you know from the news poll, we were down to probably 20-25 seats, given the magnitude of the swing, which had been entrenched not just for weeks but months and the better part of 2 years. My job, as they put it to me, Chris Bowen and the other folks who wanted me to come back to leadership, was, Kevin, just come and please save the furniture so that some of us survive. And against that measure, by turning in a result with 55, I think, seats we ended up holding, enough for Bill to frankly almost win the subsequent election, I'd done my bit. But the idea that this was some great opportunity to continue on as Prime Minister of the country, oh God, come on, be real. I mean, I knew what I was up against. I was...
Why did you do it then?
Oh, Catholic guilt. I haven't got it. You're Greek, you understand that.
I've got a bit of guilt going on, yeah.
Yeah. So Carvelis is a good Irish name. No, it's a bit of a sense of duty, I suppose, to the show. And remember, by the time, just as Col Allen came to do his darndest, your news poll had us for the first time in 2.5 years at 50-50. And that's when that campaign kicked in. There was, therefore, in that first month of my return, a levelling of the political contest. But once the Murdoch Party joined the Liberal Party in their continuing coalition of activity, frankly, it was almost impossible to get any clear air. So going back to the Bill question, you know, was I therefore ecstatic that Bill had said, yes, I'd like you to come back as leader to save a bunch of Victorian seats? No, I just saw it as saving the furniture, and we did. And we changed the rule of the party.
You did, and now you're lobbying Julie Bishop to change the rule, and she doesn't seem...
Keen.
She doesn't seem to think that your advocacy is helpful.
She said at my book launch the other day, when I said the Labor Party's got the Rudd rule, Julie can have the Bishop rule for the Liberal Party. Same thing about the election of leader, complex process, 3 months, yada, yada, yada. She then intervened or interjected in my book launch yesterday in Canberra and said, that's very unhelpful. And I said to Julie, I've never been here to helpful, just to be constructive. So,
Well, Kevin Rudd, thank you for speaking to me, but I know that the audience has some questions, so let's begin that process. Who's up first?
Don't feel obliged, any of you.
No, they're coming.
That's right, it's Melbourne. People do that.
People love democracy in Melbourne. We've got no problem with democracy in Melbourne.
That's right.
Home of democracy, not far from Ballarat. Hi, Kevin. My name's Tully Smith.
From
Very
Ballarat?
insightful speech tonight. You mentioned briefly, you touched on, well, not a little bit more than briefly, but you touched on the global financial crisis and your role in the NBN. Kevin, in your term as Prime Minister, though, we saw a lot more nation-building activities take place. We saw things like the NDIS, we saw huge investments in infrastructure, in particular road and rail, things like paternal leave and healthcare. I think that you are one of the true nation-building leaders this country has ever had.
Can we let this guy go on for
And,
It sounds just like my questions.
but seriously on that, 2 points. One, do you think the role of the nation-building Prime Minister is over, given some of the things you touched on with media, news cycle and leadership throws? And two, do you think we as a nation need to have a conversation about the role of former Prime Ministers, a little bit more established, like the role of former Presidents of the United States?
The great thing about having so many former Prime Ministers is that we'll soon run out. It'll be my turn again. So it was a joke, okay? It was a joke. So on the first point, look, it's in the DNA of the Australian Labor Party to be in the business of nation building. When I think of the earliest Prime Ministers of this country, Andrew Fisher, for example, Queenslander, the capital of Australia was Melbourne in those days. The whole idea of establishing a nation, in that stage, 5 million people across this vast continent, the central role of government. His equivalent of the National Broadband network in those days was building the Transcontinental Railway from here to Perth. A national currency, a Royal Australian Navy. These were big nation-building projects at the time. I don't think the time has evaporated because there'll be new changes, new challenges to face, like the National Broadband Network in the future as well. And as for the political, or shall I say ideological opposition, which is this is no role for government, for God's sake, the country's huge and the population is small. We cannot effectively build this nation in the absence of the agency of government. And I'm a pro-market guy. I actually believe in free markets. But if there was no nation building, this country would be without its infrastructure. And I can't see that equation changing for the future either. As for the role of former PMs, my view is as long as they've got something constructive to do and to contribute. I'm a China guy. We haven't talked about China all night. So I'm trained as a sinologist, as a Foreign Service officer. Teresa and I served in Beijing. The think tank I head in the United States is about the future of the US-China relationship. We deal with both governments in second-track diplomacy. We are in the business of trying to make a public policy contribution to what I think is a critical relationship on security, trade, and on climate change. Now, for me, that's constructive. That's useful stuff to do. I'm sure Malcolm will end up doing something constructive. I'm not so sure about the great wrecking ball of Australian politics, Tony Abbott. Abbott's problem, essentially, is he's unemployable. You think about it. Who would give him a job?
So is it good, therefore, I know I'm being sneaky, is it good, therefore, that the government's sending Turnbull to Bali?
I don't have a problem with it because, as I reveal in the book, when Malcolm lost the leadership after the, you may remember the Godwin-Gretsch affair, when Utegate, when Malcolm accused him of being corrupt in the Parliament, and he discovered that it was based on a forged email from a disgruntled Treasury officer. Anyway, he lost the leadership. That was in 2009. Malcolm was a bit of a wreck after that. Just announced he was going to leave Parliament. And then, as I say in the book, I actually invited him round to the lodge. To Kirribilli.
Offered for him to be the climate envoy.
I offered him to be the climate envoy. And he was actively considering it. He then changed his mind, having announced he was leaving Wentworth, and said he was going to stay. So I can't be hypocritical and say that if I offered him that back then, that it's wrong for him to undertake a role on behalf of Australia today. I'm a little perplexed as to why he may not have taken some of those factors into account when another prominent Australian was interested in being a candidate for another international position. But them's the breaks.
Hi, Kevin. Is it okay if I address you as Kevin?
Yeah.
So, my name is Jennifer. I am a proud student of LaTrobe University, and I've been quite a supporter since 2007.
Hey.
Did you have a T-shirt?
Sorry?
Did you have a Kevin 07 T-shirt?
No, unfortunately.
Okay,
Otherwise, I'd
we'll
get it signed.
organise you one. We're still making them.
I apologise if you are unable to answer this question. However, I recently read an article about gun lobbying, and that so there was a gun lobbying group which had some kind of had influence in the Queensland State campaign under the Flickr campaign. Now, their new sites are to focus on the next national election, and to look into legislation and have quite an effect, just similar to what's happening in America. So my question is, what's your opinion on this, and what can we do as a democracy to not prevent but to have our say? Because one of their main points is to reverse the Port Arthur legislation.
Okay, let me answer that. I think the smart thing for us to do, so as you don't go down the American road, is to continually cheer for John Howard's reform of what he did in 1996 after Port Arthur. I always do. I mean, in America, where I'm in these debates from time to time as well, I've been on Fox, Murdoch's.
I haven't worked for Rupert Murdoch for 4 years, but anyway, please continue.
Well, I haven't been Prime Minister for 5, but I'm still answering for the Labor Party. We all have our crosses to bear. So when I've been on Fox, this is really interesting. You go on Fox and you've got this sort of rabid gun lobby, and it's always active after the most recent mass killing. And in America, these happen, frankly, about every few weeks. I mean, mass killings. Killings involving 4 or 5 people happen almost, as a matter of routine. But when I go on these programs and say, I fully support the actions by the then Conservative Prime Minister of Australia to ban semi-automatics and put grave restrictions on a whole series of other weapons categories, because we had one mass killing at Port Arthur, and the whole country said never again. And so I think there's a real wisdom in us politically getting out there and backing that Howard change in, because it says something to the conservative side of Australia who would be so tempted. By the way, the other argument that I use on Fox News in the United States is this. I grew up on a farm in rural Queensland. My father had one shotgun. We had 500 acres. Bunch of feral animals. I always remember him only ever using it once. And then I say to the Americans, my father, if you were to say to him that he needed a semi-automatic weapon to control feral animals on his farm, would have said it was unmanly. Not sure my father would have said that, but it worked for an American audience. Anyway, I think we invoke Howard in response to any pressures for change here, and all of us need to dig in on this big time.
Because just to add to sorry.
We'll have a chat afterwards. Is that okay?
Oh, no worries. Thank you.
Thank you. Good.
Hi, I'm Lionel. With the CPRS and the Greens not voting for it with you, do you believe that was a strategic error of theirs, or a vote for principle over practicality? And could there have been anything else done to appeal to their tragic loss, if you like, of not taking that forward at the time?
Well, I have great trust in Penny Wong. I think she'll make a brilliant foreign minister if there's a change of government next year. Really smart woman, really knows her stuff, and she was a brilliant negotiator, and she was in the Senate. So I entrusted Penny with these negotiations, and she said to me she had pushed this as far as she could in terms of a possible deal with the Greens, and I trust her on that. Why I think it was ultimately just purely opportunistic politics by the Greens is roll the clock along from 2009 to 2010-11, when Bob Brown decided then to back Julia's carbon tax. The carbon tax was a much less rigorous regime in terms of greenhouse gas, or carbon pricing, than was the case with the carbon pollution reduction scheme. So the Greens ended up backing wholeheartedly a much weaker regime than the one that they rejected twice when we put that before the Parliament. So I'd say this, in all sincerity to the Green Party, One of these days, you just got to own up nationally to the fact that we're not for your opportunistic opposition in order to bleed Labor votes from the left, from the Labor Party into the Green Party. We'd now be almost 10 years into a carbon pricing regime in this country.
Good evening, Mr. Rudd. My name is Tony.
G'day, mate.
Hi. Recently, US Vice President Mike Pence delivered a speech that represents the strongest denunciation to date of China, referencing its militarization of the South China Sea, human rights record, intention to become a leader in up to 90% of the world's high-tech industries, forced IP transfers, among other issues.
Yeah, I read it, mate.
Yeah. This presents us with the strongest indication so far that the United States fully intends on embarking on a path of strategic rivalry with China, and analysts and columnists have described this as a new Cold War era that we are entering. My question is, as Australians, should we be more worried about the more confrontational stance that the Trump administration seems determined to take with regards to China?
Yeah, good. It's a huge speech which Pence has made, and it comes off the back of a new US national security strategy last December, new US national defence strategy in January, the trade war, plus a new defence industry strategy from the administration. And the Pence speech was kind of like the icing on the cake, formally declaring the end of 40 years of strategic engagement between the US and China, and formally announcing the beginning of what they describe as a new era of strategic competition. So, detailed response that I've given to this, if you're interested, is I've just done an article on Foreign Affairs magazine. It's on the website. You can get it. And there's a longer piece on the Asia Society website, which is a speech I gave to the US Naval College at Annapolis about 2 or 3 weeks ago. But in summary, there is a radical change in sentiment in the United States towards China. It's not just Trump. It's bipartisan. It involves business. It involves academia. And it involves non-government organisations as well, for a range of different reasons and interests and values. So therefore, the Chinese, I think, correctly have concluded that the season has changed and that we're in radically new strategic territory. My question to the Americans, however, and therefore for Australian policymakers, is this. If we're now in a period of competition, strategic competition, what are the rules of the road? For 40 years, we've evolved rules of the road in dealing with between China and the United States. Now, there may be none. And when you have a near miss between a US and Chinese naval vessel in the South China Sea by 40 yards 1 month ago from a collision, and we know what the politics of escalation are from our studies of this around the world, then I'm quite anxious about where we've now suddenly plunged. But if you're interested in a more detailed answer, it's in the 2 documents I've just referred to.
Thank you.
Yep. My name is Jirokwe. I've been here in Australia for almost 2.5 years now, and I work in the construction industry. A question, I'll start with the very known author that you mentioned before, Francis Fukuyama, when he said the end of history, when the two ideological that were prevailing ended. The former Prime Minister just proved it now, according to me, because the institution like LaTrobe University, like the media, were there during those ideologies. But when one ideology was killed, there's no more ideologies that are competing. The reason I say so, I'm going to ask the question, is the former Prime Minister has been blaming, if some of you have heard with me, Robert Murdoch, throughout. And the Murdoch media and those who used it, he mentioned clearly, they use fear. It's like some of you that have seen a large number of immigrants going to the United States, crossing the bridge. The other left, center left, does not give a solution to how these people coming to the country will be treated. And the one who is using the media, the Murdoch media, is telling the people that look at what is coming. You already have homeless, you already have unemployment, and if these people come in, we will be in problem. That's how they win. And the other side that has no ideology to debate with, they lose. And later on, they blame the media. That's how Trump came. Coming to my question is, now that you are not in a position of government, can you be very much come forward on behalf of the center-left to debate how these issues that the media magnified can be debated like here? For example, we got an issue in Victoria that has been used by the media and by the politician in Canberra by making a sweeping statement that there are criminals in Victoria. The Labour government or the Labour Party of which you are in has never come forward with how they will solve the failures of immigrants that has come to this country.
Got it, mate. Let me have a go at that. Thank you for the question. The essential question that we've got, and one of the big ones for not just this country's future, but so many Western democracies and other countries as well, is we ain't seen nothing yet in terms of the explosion in unauthorized people movements around the world, whether it's from Guatemala through Mexico and the United States, whether it's from North Africa into Europe, whether it's out of Syria and Iraq and to the rest of the world, etc. We know what's happened in this country, and we know what is happening in Europe and elsewhere. What I believe passionately to be the answer to this is a new global compact which has just 4 basic characteristics. One for source countries, one for neighbouring countries when people exit, one for transit countries as people are on the move, and one for destination countries when resettlement is necessary for those deemed to be refugees. This is not possible under the existing international cooperative arrangements, under the existing Refugees Convention. The Refugees Convention should not be changed. Refugees should be protected. That's what we learnt from the Holocaust and the Second World War. And that's why we have a Refugees Convention agreed to by all of us back in 1954. What's changed is the scale across the world. And therefore, what we need to have is that when people move out of a country for whatever reason into a neighbouring country, an automatic international agreement should come into effect which provides all the resources necessary to accommodate and support in humane conditions those people when they've moved to their country of first asylum. In the case of Syria, for example, that was either into Turkey or into Jordan or into Lebanon. Those countries, frankly, just buckled at the seams while the international community walked away in 2011, 2012, 2013. So what happened? They went on the march into Europe because that was the only place you'd go. If it was me, that's what I would have done too. If my family of 3 kids had their daily living allowance cut in half because there was no money to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees to pay them. The second thing is, if people then go on the move, then the UNHCR itself, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, should be resourced to provide transit centres and transit processing arrangements for the caseload which are funded by the international community through the UNHCR. So whatever country it's in, you have transit centres, proper accommodation, proper support, proper processing so that each person's case can be clarified as to whether they are a bona fide refugee or not. And the final element of this global compact is, let's just say half the caseload is bona fide, real refugees. They go back, they get shot, or there's a real danger to their lives. We need to have a global burden sharing arrangement across all the advanced economies in the world, whereby, based on our size of the global economy, that country takes a proportional number of refugees. The Americans take a lot, the Canadians take a lot, we should take a lot, but so should the Japanese, who currently take none, and other countries in Europe, who some take a lot and some take none. Now, that is the way in which we can have a global solution to what is going to be a mounting global problem.
Yeah, but before we have the global solution, there's the Australia issue. Yeah. And you warned on the night that you lost the leadership against a lurch to the right. And then?
Well, what happened after?
Then you said no people would come to Australia off
Okay,
PNG.
Patricia Karvelis, listen to me very carefully.
But you did. I heard you.
Hang on, let me I know I said that.
But now you say they should come to Australia.
Can I answer the question?
Sure.
Thank you. It's along these lines. In 2010, after the coup, one of the things that Julia had campaigned on internally in the Labor Party was that I was too soft on asylum seekers. That's true. She said it openly. And straight after, as you know, she had then announced the East Timor solution to send everyone to East Timor for offshore processing, except the East Timor government then didn't agree. She then went to the Malaysia solution, you may remember that one, an agreement with Malaysia to do the same. The High Court knocked that over. In 2012, Julia reopened the Pacific solution by opening camps again on Nauru and in Manus. 2013, I come back into office for 3 months. What I say, having inherited this set of arrangements, was we've got to make this work. So the bilateral agreement that I then had with Papua New Guinea and Nauru was as follows: a 12-month agreement. Secondly, to be reviewed after 12 months in terms of whether it was cancelled, changed or whatever. That the accommodation of asylum seekers under the terms of that agreement would be compatible with Unhcr global humane standards. Thirdly, that there will be settlement areas right across the urban areas of Papua New Guinea mainland, not out in bloody Manus. And that fourthly, resettlement to countries like New Zealand would be perfectly acceptable under those arrangements. I was in office for 3 months. When Abbott took over, what did he do? He turned a 12-month agreement into a permanent arrangement. The accommodation arrangements and the incarceration arrangements were turned into gulags deliberately. And thirdly, resettlement possibilities with New Zealand and anywhere else were rejected out of hand in order to send a punitive message to the world. So I've got to the stage where I'm a little sick and tired of these guys and people in the media saying that what we took on, and I took on as an arrangement in my 3 months back in office for a 12-month period, as used and abused by the Conservatives who came after me, is somehow therefore my responsibility. It's not. It's a 12-month arrangement. Did I use hard language at the time?
You said they would never come to Australia, Kevin.
And at that time, Patricia Karvelas, as a journalist, you know there was a document issued to you in the media which said in black and white...
But your words matter, don't they?
And what was said in black and white was absolutely critical as well. It said, this is a 12-month agreement. If you chose not to report that and instead emphasise what I said as a direct message to people smugglers to stop their...
I thought you meant it.
To stop. Well, hang on. You've got to send a message to people smugglers. What's the other side of this equation? We were losing something in the order of 300 people a month through drownings. And the message I was trying to send out to them was that this was not possible. But in your reporting and that of the media, to simply take that statement in isolation from the text of the agreement and to ignore the text of the agreement is not fair and balanced reporting. And I refuse to take responsibility for that's the Conservatives, use and abuse of that agreement and turning that 12-month arrangement into a bunch of gulags for which they should hang their head in shame.
Next question.
Can we make this the last question? We've gone considerably over time, and
that
we want
Kevin
to.
Rudd's fault. He spent
and we want to save some time.
You asked a very long question.
And we want to save some time for Mr. Rudd to do some book signing as well. So, last question. Thank you.
I'm happy to talk to these folks afterwards if you'd like to have a chat. So.
G'day, my name's Travis. When your good mate Malcolm became Prime Minister a few years ago, he did so on a promise of respecting the intelligence of the Australian people. I think the most dispassionate observer of politics could say that what followed was a policy base that was directed by a fairly intellectually vacuous analysis of polls and not particularly good policy. So my question is a really simple one. How do we make good policy in Australia again?
That's a really important question.
Make Australia great again.
It's a really important question. When we were elected in 2007, you may remember, we did so with a very big and broad policy canvas. This was no small target strategy. We outlined what we're going to do across the field. And both on the economy and the restructuring of the economy, a new agreement on national health and hospital reform, a new national curriculum for education, a new set of arrangements for Indigenous reconciliation and closing the gap, climate change action, as we've discussed this evening. And frankly, we worked hard on top of dealing with the existential crisis delivered from left field called the global financial crisis. The attack that came at the time was that we were doing too much. And in a perfect world, you'd love to slow some of that down, but we didn't expect the crisis to hit. As a result, I think what happened was a partial delegitimization of the political wisdom of running a big policy agenda into an election. Abbott in 2010 stood for nothing. Abbott in 2013, with the Murdoch mob behind him, stood for very little. He promised, I think, one thing in that campaign, which is to bring in his paid parental leave scheme for millionaires, uncapped. That was never legislated. But he actually didn't have to advance an argument. That actually established a bit of a lesson in the body politic about not arguing big policy propositions. Now, where I have some cause for encouragement is that the current Labor opposition is not actually running in that direction. They've taken a much bolder approach on public policy development, and you've seen what they've had to say, for example, on the future of negative gearing, the future of housing and asset bubbles within the Australian economy. So if they succeed at the next election, and I have some confidence that they will in forming the next government of Australia, it rebirths the idea of a big policy agenda. My final point to the body politic is kind of this. I just wish Australians generally would get to the stage where people who engage in a serious intellectual public policy debate about real options to deal with our massive challenges for the future on climate, on refugees, on the question of the diversification of the economy, we could do so without people being ridiculed as a bunch of intellectual wankers. I mean, the whole subculture of this country, whereby that's all just stuff that the public political process should have nothing to do with, while, you know, Barnaby and Tony Abbott go the biff because that's more entertaining. I mean, it's so demeaning of the country and frankly so destructive of where we need to be as a nation.
Well, I'm sorry I've got to draw this fascinating discussion to a close, but time has caught up with us, and I'm sorry for the people lined up there to ask questions, but you didn't have the opportunity. But Kevin has said that he'll be out there book signing, so you'll have another opportunity to ask him questions. Before I move the formal vote of thanks, I'd just like to draw your attention to some other events which are coming up soon. In fact, the first one is tomorrow night is Democracy Broken, which is obviously a highly relevant segue from tonight's discussion. It'll be led by Tony Walker, who is Vice-Chancellor's Fellow at LaTrobe, and I should add is a Fairfax, not a Murdoch journalist of note, and he'll have a panel behind him, and that's going to be held at the State Library Theatrette. And next month, Dr. Cassandra Goldie at Frank Brennan will be discussing social justice for our Ideas in Society series, and our final Bold Thinking series for this year in 2018 will be Julie Bishop, who may be able to reflect on the Bishop solution to the
the Bishop solution,
the rotating prime ministers we've had in recent times from the Conservative side of politics. Well, I think we've had a fascinating evening. First, I'd like to thank Patricia for her wonderful questioning and calling the former Prime Minister to account and giving him the opportunity to expound his point of view. And finally, and most of all, I'd like to thank Kevin Rudd himself. I think we've seen the display of a huge intellect, someone with an enormous grasp of so many issues of policy, global factors, as well as the retrospective on domestic factors, and I think we all hope that he will continue to make an enormous contribution to the policy debate internationally and hopefully in Australia into the future. I encourage you to buy his 2 volumes of his books. I'm sure they'll be fascinating reading. I must confess I haven't had time yet, but I certainly will, and I encourage you to do so. I'd also like to thank the audience before I ask you to thank the 2 speakers, but I'd like to thank you for your interest and obviously engagement with tonight's proceedings, and I'm sorry for the lineup of questioners that you couldn't all have your questions held, but it's an indication of the respect with which Kevin Rudd is held by the community and also by your involvement and wish to make a difference to the fact that we do have a bit of a policy vacuum at the moment. So could you please show your appreciation to Kevin and Patricia?